Hello. In this video I want to quickly talk about the different types of variables in JavaScript and what actually are the differences between them. So I'm just going to run with my Node 22.8 installation on my computer. I'm going to run in watch mode this playground.js file so that when it gets done running and I make a change and save, it'll just run the script again. And so if I say console.log the variable const a, and then I define const a equals a, it'll log a. So const a is a const variable. It has this name. I could give it any name, but I choose to give it this name, and because it's a constant, it can't be changed. So if I try to say const a equals aa on the next line, it's not going to let me do that. It's going to say assignment to a constant variable is a type error. You can't do that. Another thing you can't do is define on one line and set the value on another line. It says missing initialization in the const declaration, so you always need to have those two things together with a const. That's pretty much what you need to know about a const. Also, when you have an enclosing scope and you were to say const a equals b const a, like that, so we're just going to log that. You're going to have this problem of assignment to a constant variable. So because the const a variable is available inside of this enclosed scope, like consider this were any kind of scope you might be used to, like an if statement, like if 1 equal some variable that was the value of 1. So I'll just say 1 explicitly there. This is always going to be true, and I might want to, create a const a variable just for inside of this scope, but I can't do that because const a already exists outside the scope, and I also can't change the value to const a like this because it is a constant, and constants obviously are constant, they can't change. So the solution to this is that when you want to do some of these things you can't do with a const, you could step up and use a let variable. So a let variable would be like let we'll do let b, or it could be a, let a, and then you could change the value on the next line like that. You could also change the value inside of an enclosing scope, and so let's see what the problem is now. We have the value name is let a, so we'll change these to let a, and we're assigning to a constant variable, so let's change this to let, and then we are fine. We can change this to AA on this line, so if I take away that, you'll see it's AA, and we can have A, we can change it to B, and whatever else we might want to do. So the advantage here is obviously we can make changes to it, and we can make changes from inside an enclosing scope. We can set the value on another line like this. We can also do this in two separate steps. So we can declare this let a and then not actually set the value until down here. So if we were to say like that, the value would be undefined here because it hasn't yet been defined, but as soon as it gets defined, then it can have that value of b, and it can keep that value after it leaves this enclosing scope. Now the other cool thing about let variables is that you can reuse the let keyword with the same variable name, and you can get a different variable inside of an enclosing scope. So whereas here let a is going to have the value of a outside on the global scope, we'll see a is printing here, and that's here and here, and then we can change it to b inside of here, and it doesn't stay changed when we leave the scope. And that's because we let our own name called let a inside this scope, and it can have a different meaning inside of here than it has in the global scope. And so when we exit this, this let a gets destroyed essentially, and we revert back to this one. Now you couldn't do the same thing if you were to say something like this. You can't redeclare because it's in the same scope, so it doesn't make sense to be letting that to a different value now. You would have to actually change the value of the variable. So you can change the value, or you can use that let to create a new one. So when you just do that, it changes the value. When you use the let keyword, it creates a new one that has its own value. Now step up to the var keyword and it functions similarly, except var is going to pollute the enclosing scope, whereas let would be able to have its own version of let a in here. This version of let a, or I guess it's, you know, really it's var a or var b or something like that now, this is going to pollute the b value up to this let a right here, and that's why it's still b when we leave the scope. It's still b because we used that var keyword. Essentially the same functionality if we didn't have the var keyword at all. The only difference being if we didn't have the var, if we did have the var keyword here, but let's say this variable didn't yet exist up here, then this variable can be declared for the first time inside of this enclosing scope and then still continue to be available afterwards. Whereas if we simply did this, obviously the variable has not been declared, so it's kind of explicitly a var, but this is pretty poor practice, and most linters and you know, the browsers and Node will oftentimes complain about you using a variable that you haven't explicitly defined with the var keyword, because you're kind of accidentally making an assumption that this is a variable that you want to be available throughout. So it's always good to either use let, var, or const. And you should kind of, I usually use the hierarchy to use const by default, and then only change to let if I need a feature of let, and only change to var if I need a feature of var. So typically what you would use, for example, if you have a constant that you want to be available throughout your code, would be you would just do const variable name equals something. A case where you'll use a variable oftentimes is in a for loop. So if you're going to do a for loop, a let is the optimal one to use there, because if you think about trying to, let's get this settled here. Think about trying to use a const. Well, typically a loop will change the value of that variable, so const is not possible because you're trying to change it. So you'll need to step up to a let. And you could technically step up to a var, but then you run into the problem if you have two separate loops that both have this, and then your global scope also has, you know, const I, or more likely like var I or something, var I equals 0, and then, or let's say -1, something that these loops would never do. Then you come down here and you console .log I, and it's going to be 10 from the last time you ran this loop. But if this one had gone to, you know, 100 instead of 10, it's still going to be 10 because this loop is going to override the var, and it overrode this var too. And so only if you do these in a certain order will you get a certain outcome. And if you had none of those loops, you would have the actual -1 value you would expect on this global scope. So it would make more sense in a case like this to use that let keyword, because then you would simply have you'd simply have a different I in here, a different I in here, and a different I here, so that this can be -1 as the global I value. You'll also sometimes see issues with something like, you'll see an issue here where you've let I equals this, and so you're not going to be able to use var I because identifier I has already been declared, and so it's not going to let you violate the rules of letting something with a var down in this lower scope. So if you start with var on the top, you expose yourself to this ability that these lower scopes that could potentially pollute the global scope and make things confusing. Last thing I want to point out is that while constants are constant, objects can have values within them, and so while the object itself may not change, the value within it could change. So a very simple example of this, we have this variable being 42, and if we say, you know, constant equals, or like constant plus plus, we want to turn it to 43. Now obviously we can't do that because it's a constant, but as soon as we wrap this in some kind of object, like this is an array, and we, you know, break off the brackets of this when we print it, we can print that 42, and then we can easily say that constant at 0 plus plus, and say the thing that's inside of this array at the 0 index can be increased by 1. That's totally valid to do, and we can do that as many times as we want. And we could do the same thing if we wanted to make this an object, and we had the object of, val key is equal to 42, and then we just say const dot val plus plus, and again, let's see, const, oh yeah, so this is no longer, so we just want constant dot val because it's no longer an array. Then we can increase that enclosed variable of val as many times as we like. Even though we are changing something, we're not changing the object itself. So what we could not do would be say constant equals val constant dot val plus 1. This would not be allowed. Whereas if you access that in internal thing and then change it, that is completely fine. So just a little point is that it's totally fine. You might think, oh, I need to step up to a let or a var. You may actually be able to keep a constant if you have an object, because you can keep that object the same and modify what's inside of that object. So that should wrap it up for this video, showing you the difference between const, let, and var variables, and some of the challenges you can encounter if you're not careful with those. So thank you for watching, and that'll wrap it up for this one.